Welcome to this video. The Divine Will is Catholic. And my name's Bob. I've been the administrator at Elijah's Cloak channel since its inception, which is roughly 2.5 years. My background is I'm an oblate of the Benedictines of the Divine Will. I've had a formation as a secular with the Carmelite order, and I'm very grateful for it. I have a background as a catechist as well. Now let us begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So what we'll do is we'll explore how the divine will complements and fits in to the deposit of the faith, and it doesn't contradict anything that's been passed on to us through the church. And we're going to start right in the beginning in the most important aspect of the divine will, and that is the gift of the divine will itself. And what is that gift? It is the sharing of God's holy divine will. Easy to say that, but there's a lot of implications to that. And what that entails, when I say sharing, is we are giving access to the divine will, so to speak, with the participation of Jesus, where we're allowed to utilize and operate within God's divine will. As we grow in the divine will and we reach the highest degree, we will have the gift continuously and we will possess it ourselves. So we will share God's will to the point where we will actually possess it. Now what I'd like to do is start off with a quote, and I want to introduce a concept that I think is critical to understanding how the divine will relates to the church and also to the faith. And I'm starting off with a quote from the Book of Heaven, September 11th, 1922, just a little bit over 100 years ago. And the quote reads, this is Jesus to Luisa, "Now the fulfillment of the work of creation was that man would do our will in everything. Our will was to be the life, the food, the crown of the creature. And since it is not yet so, the work of creation is not yet fulfilled, and neither can I rest in it, nor can it rest in me." And he goes on to say, a little further on, "This is why I love, and I want so much that the way of living in my will be known, nor will I ever be able to say that the works of creation and redemption are fulfilled if I do not have all the acts of the creature extending in my will." So there are a number of different concepts that are introduced in that small passage. And the one I want to highlight here is the idea of the crown of the creature. And this is a concept that's been elaborated upon by Daniel O'Connor very successfully. The idea is that the divine will is the crown of our souls. And Jesus teaches Luisa that God's will is omnipresent throughout all of creation. So by necessity, if you're allowed to share in it, you're also given access to that omnipresence. And Jesus refers to this omnipresence to Luisa as bilocating. And bilocating is often confused with the bilocation of, say, Padre Pio, where you're physically in multiple locations at once. This is actually a spiritual presence, a spiritual bilocation. In other words, sharing God's omnipresence, like I mentioned. And this omnipresence means that you have access to all of creation, both past, present, and future. And that means all of the acts of creation, all the acts that were performed by creatures, the creatures themselves. And this omnipresence is not new in the church at all. The church has always known that God is omnipresent through all creation. What is new, however, is sharing in God's divine will, the gift itself. I mentioned that there are serious implications of this gift. One is, by the very nature of God's divine will, when he operates in his will, the acts which he performs are also divine. As we share in God's will, we share in this creation of these divine acts. And these acts that are performed in sharing God's divine will also mean that virtues that are practiced would also have that divine nature as well. And there's great implications for those who have achieved sanctity prior to the gift being provided to Luisa, and through Luisa to us. And they needed to obtain levels of sanctity by practicing heroic virtue. And this practice was very difficult. The practice of heroic virtue was often contradicted by the opposite of that virtue, which was the sinful opposite of the virtue. And Jesus several times discusses with Luisa the difference between achieving sanctity by possessing the divine will and living the divine will, compared with achieving sanctity by virtue alone, and how much difficult it is by pursuing it, as our saints did prior to the gift that Luisa received of the divine will. So not only is it easier to achieve sanctity, but because of the divine will itself, you're able to achieve sanctity that was not available prior to the gift of the divine will. Before we move on to the next subject, I want to go back to the quote. And in the quote, Jesus said that the fulfillment of the work of creation was that man would do our will in everything. Now I want to mention a couple things here, and it's an important distinction between doing God's will and living in God's will. Now when Jesus talks about doing our will in everything here, he uses the verb do sometimes, but he's really speaking of living in God's will. And the difference is that the saints, again, prior to the gift of Luisa, they would try to do God's will the best they could. But what that meant is that doing God's will is conforming to God's will, is to be resigned to God's will. Whereas living God's will is sharing it. The living God's will speaks to the gift itself, which is sharing God's will. Saint Therese mentions this in her writing. She talks about the difference between union and unity, where she says, in union there are two, but in unity there is but one. I like the analogy of the royal family, where doing God's will, you do God's will as a subject, but in living God's will, God sees that which is familiar to him in you. He sees his own essence. He sees his own life. And you are a member of his royal family. And with this discussion of the gift of the divine will, and also a lengthy discussion of the implications of it, there's nothing in the gift or the implications that contradicts the faith. It doesn't replace or change one syllable of the Apostles' Creed. And I'd like to explore and also explain some of the other teachings of Jesus concerning other aspects of the divine will. Now, one is the prayer of the rounds. And the rounds is a contemplative prayer where someone living in the divine will can make reparation for acts in the past and even the present, and for that matter, even the future acts that have yet to be performed because of the omnipresence of the divine will, as was discussed. Make reparation and repair for acts that were performed imperfectly prior to this gift being available. So they are being repaired as if those acts were performed by someone who lived in the divine will and who also retained, in other words, retained the nature of Adam, who lived in the divine will prior to his fall. And this reparation makes it as though that fall never occurred in these acts that are being repaired. The round could also be the round of creation, where you go through creation and you leave a loving thanks for all that God has created. Another type of round is to repeat the acts of Jesus. And of course, acts of Jesus are divine to begin with, and they do not need to be repaired. So you can repeat them as if you were doing them. And that leads to a discussion that Father Elijah had in Medjugorje recently. That was one of my recent videos. And Father Elijah mentioned that his favorite round is the Mass. And some people did not quite understand that. Well, Jesus explains to Luisa that within the Mass and the Eucharist, Jesus lives his entire life every day within the Eucharist. So you think about his confection and the bread and the wine by the priest. He's again becoming incarnate. It's another incarnation. And then you have the sacrificial nature of the Mass. He's living his entire life all the way through the sacrifice that he made at Calvary. And then he's being consumed and resurrected again in our souls. So that's a way of looking at the Mass where you're actually repeating the entire life of Jesus and all his acts. Again, it's a contemplative type of a prayer. And my favorite type of round is the Rosary. And the Rosary is a prayer that Jesus discusses in the Book of Heaven. It's a very important prayer that everyone who lives in the divine will should be doing. And when I say it's a round, we are living the mysteries of Jesus in the Rosary. And I especially like to live in the sorrowful mysteries of Jesus. Again, it's all very Catholic. I'd like to return to the quote that we read from the Book of Heaven one more time and talk about the crown. And towards the end of the quote, Jesus says, and I'll read this one more time, "This is why I love and want so much that the way of living in my will be known, nor will I be able to say that the works of creation and redemption are fulfilled if I do not have all the acts of the creature extending in my will." And what I'd like to emphasize here is the continuity that Jesus expresses between the first fiat, the second, and the third. The first being creation, the second fiat being redemption, and the third fiat being sanctification, living in his divine will. He portrays the third fiat as being the crown of creation and redemption, because the two are together. The two fiats are tied together. There's a continuity between them and also between the third fiat. And the third fiat returns man to his prior state, where Adam also enjoyed the gift of the divine will, but he fell. And Adam's fall has lost us that gift. And it's being restored to us via this sanctification. But we'll actually be in a better place, because Adam did not have the advantage of having our Blessed Mother, who also lived in the divine will, as his mother. It's an advantage that we have over Adam. And also, Adam does not have the advantage of the gifts of the redemption that we received. But the important teaching here from Jesus is that Jesus explains that these three fiats are related. In other words, they don't replace one of the other. The third fiat does not replace the second or the first. They are tied together. Another teaching of Jesus is related to the 4 degrees of the divine will. And these degrees, they're very similar to the teaching of Saint Teresa of Avila regarding the 7 mansions in her classical book, Interior Castle. Now, it is true that there are many unique degrees within these 4 degrees. That is definitely true. However, that does not diminish the importance of the 4 degrees. And you may say, why are they so important? That's for the same reason that St. Teresa of Avila wrote about the 7 mansions. They're a way of describing where you are spiritually. And if you think about what information is needed to get to a destination, you need 2 pieces of important information. You need to know where you're going, and you need to know where you are. And the 4 degrees help illustrate that. It also speaks against the false interpretation that you're either in or out of the divine will. In other words, if you're in the divine will, everything is the same, everyone is the same, and everyone's at the same level because they have the gift. And the 4 degrees is a means of Jesus explaining that even if you just entered the divine will, you have a way to go. There's a lot of improvement. And going back to unique degrees within the degrees, St. Teresa says something very similar, that there's many rooms in these mansions. And just as there's many rooms in the mansions of St. Teresa of Avila, there are many paths through the degrees of the divine will from the 1st to the 4th. And within these paths, we'll be tested very much. And there will be multiple opportunities, many opportunities for us to provide our assent, our yes to Jesus, our fiat. And regardless of where these paths begin for each individual, one common denominator is that these paths, they're paved with 1,000 fiats. I'd like to explain in the 4 degrees that this was actually the first video of the Elijah's Cloak channel. There's a couple reasons why I did it. One is there were a lot of questions about the 4 degrees, and I was trying to provide an answer. And in another, we use the 4 degrees as a method of providing some guidance regarding spiritual growth, going through the degrees, and use that as an opportunity to dispel some misconceptions about living in the divine will. The point of the video that was made regarding the 4 degrees, one of the important points, was that the foundation of proceeding from the 1st degree onward was the good Catholic. In other words, it's very similar to a concept that some people may be familiar with. Jordan Peterson, who says, before you try to take on something very big, in other words, before you try to save the world, the way he likes to put it, first thing you should do is clean up your room. In other words, make sure that you put your life in good order before you try doing so for other people, or before you try saving the world or taking on something big. Make sure you got your life straightened out. Well, it's very similar in the spiritual life. You want to have your spiritual life straightened out before you go on the road of sanctity. And in doing so, you set the foundation for being successful in going from the 1st to the 4th degree. And also there are some misconceptions I mentioned around the sacraments, that there was this idea floating around that you didn't need to go to confession because somewhere in the Book of Heaven, Jesus explains that if you live in the 4th degree, where you live continuously in God's divine will, that there is no sin there in the 4th degree. There can't be any sin. And that is true for someone who lives at that level of sanctity. Not that the sin is impossible, but sin is contradictory to that degree of living in the 4th degree of the divine will. Because sin and the divine will, you think about it, God's divine will is mutually exclusive. And very similar to the 4 degrees, I believe that they are somewhat related, are the 9 choirs of the divine will that Jesus mentions. And these choirs are choirs of sanctity. They're choirs of the saints of the divine will. So those saints that achieve sanctity through the gift of the divine will have a structure that is described by Jesus as the 9 choirs, similar to the 9 choirs of angels, except these are for saints. And the saints would be formed on earth first, which makes sense. And it's something that adheres to our thinking regarding how sanctity is achieved. Sanctity is achieved on earth. The fruits of sanctity, the reward, are achieved in heaven, or acquired in heaven from the saintly life. And so it is with the 9 choirs. They're first formed on earth, and then they are taken and formed in heaven, which is consistent with the Catholic way of thinking of how saints are formed. Also, in this conversation regarding how the divine will is Catholic, I'd like to stress that the divine will, understanding it properly, does not lead to dispensationalism. And this was discussed in a video, the 6 misunderstandings of the divine will. And they were understandings primarily by people outside the divine will. In other words, they're not that familiar with it. And this is one of the reasons why we're doing this video, because there is some misunderstandings of people trying to understand how it fits within the deposit of the faith and within the teachings of the church. And in reviewing Luisa's clause, there was no findings that were contrary to faith and morals. But there's still some thinking that the divine will somehow dispenses with that which preceded it. In other words, some teachings from the church. And I would say that that is not the case at all. First of all, the idea of dispensationalism is a heresy. It's contradictory to the faith to begin with, without even discussing any particulars of the divine will. And if you just look at how things proceeded, I mentioned the continuity between the first, second, and third fiat. Look at some of the teachings of the Old Testament. They were not dispensed with after the redemption. When our church fathers decided to incorporate the inspired books into the Bible, they did not say, we do not need these Old Testament writings. No, they saw a continuity of the faith between the Old and the New Testaments. The Ten Commandments, as an example, are just as important to live in the divine will as they were in the Old Testament, as they were in the redemption. There is nothing in the faith that is changing. Now, what the divine will does show, and it is true throughout the history of the church, is it demonstrates that we can understand certain things better as God allows that to occur. But we're understanding that which was already revealed. So they're not new public revelations. These writings of Luisa Piccarreta, they help us increase our understanding of existing public revelation. As I frequently do, I'd like to end with a Bible quotation. And this is from Matthew chapter 25, verse 34. And this pertains to living in the divine will. Then shall the king say to them that shall be on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, possess you the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I'd like to thank you for watching, and as always, please like and subscribe. God bless. Et unam sanctam